Select your program.
Happenings.
Program initiated.
Approach the threshold. Engage rationality. Open your mind. Godspeed.
Screeching down from somewhere deep in space. This is Flagship Freedom, the podcast that places you on the front line in the war of ideas. This is Michael.
And I'm Danny Boy.
And we are here with, yet again, another Happenings episode. And Danny, I think it is time to complete the tale of two cities. How does that sound?
Let's do it, Mike.
All right. This is a completion of an episode that we began, I guess you could say a sequel to an episode that we began a couple episodes back, where we discussed the social justice movement. Now, when I talk about the Tale of Two Cities, I think of a long and expansive field. And on the one hand, you have the tower of the social justice movement. It's screaming, wailing, and crying out for justice for minorities and equality of outcome and the critical theory and cultural Marxism and conformity. But on the other side sits something, I think, much more bizarre, much more difficult to qualify, and I might even say nuanced. It's a structure that's dedicated to tradition and authority and purity. And for us libertarians and voluntarists and free society members, I think that this tower poses more of a difficulty when actually putting a name and label to the entirety of the movement. And that is the alt-right. I think after the dust settles, maybe after we discuss this whole entire movement as it stands here in America, we might be able to discover which might be more deleterious to the values of liberty. But as it is right now, I still am fighting a war in my own head as to which one is possibly worse for our beloved values of freedom. So let's talk a little bit about where I think the alt-right movement began. And Danny, I don't know, how much experience do you have with the alt-right movement? Is this something, for me, it is a fairly new movement, even though there is a lot of facet and nuance, and I would say that it's a loose collection of a lot of ideas that are old, and a lot of the leaders of it have come out in force and in recent popularity, and we might add that Donald Trump being elected just a few days ago has given some new validation to the alt-right movement. But how much do you know about it, and how much has it affected your thought?
Well, I have been also equally mystified trying to define what it is and figure out this movement and sort of splashing water around the room so I can see the ghost's face, so to speak. But I haven't run into a cohesive definition yet. I've just sort of been figuring it out based on the behavior of its supporters, and so far I'm not overly impressed. But we should, as always, try to define what we're talking about. So what would you, for the benefit of myself as well as the listeners, how would you define the alt-right?
Right. So I want to get into the specific features of the alt-right in a moment, but I think that in order to understand the alt-right, it's important to examine where I think it came from, and I think that its birth is very interesting. To give the listeners a little bit of a background, the way I prepared for this discussion was that I watched about 2 to 3 dozen different video blogs and definitions of the alt-right, as well as just listening to some of their content. Now, this isn't to say that I haven't encountered it before, because they are everywhere online. That's their home. But it is to say that without actually listening to a vast sum of people that call themselves alt-right, it's very difficult to just simply watch one and then know what precisely this is. It's easy to just write them off as, let's say, the extreme right or, the racist right or something like that. I think it is far more difficult than that. So my theory is that this is an entirely reactionary movement, much like the paleoconservatives of Pat Buchanan. They were reacting to things either within their party or, more importantly, a sort of a dark mirror of what was going on the political left. And what we see, and the reason why I call it the Tale of Two Cities, is because you have that social justice monolith on one side, and you have this other tower which represents a different side of statism and authoritarianism. And the alt-right developed from this very loud, very vocal objection to the injustices that were occurring, the perceived injustices of minorities. So for the social justice warrior, we've talked about this before, in social justice, white and whiteness isn't an ethnic identification, but it's really, it has a flexible meaning to mean the Majorian class of, oppression, exploitative overlords, Danny?
And isn't that's such a terrifying concept, that whiteness no longer that's the typical manipulation of definitions.
Right, yeah. I mean, there is a lot of different identities within the quote-unquote white people. And when you start to bunch them all up in one massive homogeneous glass of milk, it doesn't work all that well, because you realize that Europe is still also a very diverse place, and they have a lot of culture and tradition and history that date back 3,000 to 4,000 years. So yeah, whiteness to the social justice warrior, the progressive, is not just a skin color thing. Because, Danny, I would be considered, I'm supposed to check white on the government census box, but I don't really behave in many of the ways that, let's say, your Anglo-Saxon, German or WASP or Englishman does. So my descendancy comes from Greece, and I'm of Greek ethnicity, and my traditions are very different than those on the northwestern part of the continent of Europe. So that's how they might define whiteness, but I don't think they have any problem with actually being stuck to that definition. They'll perceive anything and anything that has unearned cultural or monetary or political capital as gained on the backs of minorities. They can simply stick the term onto anyone that allows them, and this allows them to work backwards from whiteness to privilege, or from privilege to whiteness.
Does that mean a black person could be engaging in whiteness by virtue of their behavior? I mean, I would think it's actually, if you were to be consistent, that would be the implication. But of course, you never see that actually happening.
So, Danny, I think that, like we were talking about in a previous episode, men like Tom Sowell and Larry Elder and Condoleezza Rice, they were constantly berated when they were growing up as being
Oreos.
Subjugated. Well, yeah, Oreos, right. White on the inside, black on the outside. I remember in Detroit, there was a gubernatorial candidate, not gubernatorial, it was a mayoral candidate that was running against the now incarcerated Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, last name of Hendricks. And Hendricks was blasted by Kilpatrick for being, quote unquote, too white. So I think that they can use the idea of whiteness against people that are minorities, because it means more than that. You don't hear it that often, but this is what the idea of the Uncle Tom means. It means that you are sort of emulating your slave masters and your oppressors.
How unbelievable it is that the idea that whiteness and blackness is a behavior has pervaded even black people's mindset and language to call other black people white when they speak a certain way, they act a certain way. I mean, that talk about having invaded and infected their mind, that you're no longer a qualified black person because you're acting as an academic or conservative. I mean, that's like mental slavery, if you ask me. That's the manipulation has corrupted their view so much that now acting a certain way makes you white. So that is really tragic and unbelievable. That
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we all know that the social justice logical error, I think it would be called affirming the consequent. When you let me set up the premises. If all people of European descent are privileged, and you are privileged,
you must be European.
Yes, you must be European. But it doesn't actually follow that. But I think more damaging and more egregious is if all privileged people are of European descent and you are European, you must be privileged, because this actually hurts a bunch of people who are from European descent that are in poverty and have their issues and are pushed up against the wall. And I think this is what might have happened with some of these Trump voters as well. I think that they felt like their voices weren't heard because you can't be privileged or you can't be white and poor.
Yeah. We're
go ahead.
a bit of a sidetrack, but we're
well. I think that the reason I wanted to make sure that people remembered this and have this in the back of their heads, because I genuinely think that the SJW, like Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, created in many aspects, the alt-right into an ugly amalgamation of a variety of old and some new qualities. Many of them are old. A couple of them are new. That's why I'm making sure that we are very familiar with this important piece of information, because we know that this is textbook racism, what we just talked about. You're applying characters of somebody, reducing their person to their physical properties. Like a rock can be looked at on the outside and everything can be identified scientifically without any mistake. Racism objectifies, dehumanizes, it destroys. That's why racism is bad. It's not because it oppresses. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always. It doesn't always manifest itself in oppression. This is the reaction. This is the root of the reactionary movement known as the alt-right. I think the reason why it was born again in America, even though it has come to terms in many other places in many different times, as we'll talk about a little later. But the alt-right, I thought, started with genuine concerns, whites searching for an identity and wanting a voice and recognizing that logical fallacy. But then they start to propose half-baked and even harmful solutions. And this is where the alt-right goes astray in their prescriptions. Maybe not so much their observations, just like the social justice movement. So
it seems to be, in a nutshell, kind of an overblown reaction, an overreaction in a sense. And
yes,
I think actually, if you trace it back, probably a lot of the social justice movement could be described as the same. A reaction to KKK culture, etc. But the problem is, it's not a measured and nuanced reaction. It's completely out of proportion and unhinged. So that seems to be the problem, is we gyrate between two ridiculous positions, and there's truth on both sides, but that's our job, is to weed out the nonsense from the truth.
Yeah, it gives credence to that old Hegelian idea of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that history moves back and forth, oscillates between two ideas, and then they synthesize between one another. Both thesis and antithesis are the opposite of one another, and they react against each other, and then they come together in a synthesization or a synthesis. And then the pattern starts again. How you described it reminds me exactly of how Hegel thought of how history works. But anyways, the alt-right, I think, is interested in counteracting this definition. They want to reel back the definition to its more primitive, original roots of European ancestry. Okay, but the problem there, in my perception, is that they fall into the same trap of reducing cultural success to innate qualities in persons of certain races. So they commit similar problems with that the social justice warriors do. They are reductionists in many ways, as many authoritarian statists tend to be. People like Danny and I, they see the individual as the necessary atomic level, and it cannot be broken down because it's very and look, I mean, I know that the atom can be broken, so the metaphor might break there, but what we mean to say is that an individual is so nuanced, so difficult to understand, it is difficult to define and to govern. So the best way to govern them is just simply allow them to do it themselves, because we don't know how the needs and wants and the values of each individual. And for us to create a cohesive society ends up failing over and over and over again. But the statist and the authoritarian believes that they know best. And they come in and they want to define and reduce human to their basic constituent parts. And this is problematic. This is what the SJWs do. This is what the alt-right does. So are you following me, Danny, so far?
Okay. So are we saying, because I want to be fair to them.
Yeah.
There is I think they call it race realism now, where
yes.
Some people, of course, would call it racism. Other people just say it's a scientific observation of several qualities, namely intelligence being linked to your race and your genetics. So
absolutely.
Is it possible to recognize and even allow these observations, whether or not they're valid, assuming they're valid, to shape your policy view? Like basically I'm trying to separate the good from the bad and, not prematurely accuse anyone of racism.
Right. And I want to note this, that those in the alt-right, it is a vast movement, and it is still, I think, forming leadership, even though there are strong leaders that I can name, men like Milo Yiannopoulos, you've got Jared Taylor, you've got Sam Francis, Paul Ramsey, Richard Spencer. These are people that you may or may not know. I think Yiannopoulos has been on the forefront of the media quite a bit because he's rather a more outspoken and also flamboyant member of the alt-right, and his presence on Breitbart and the media tends to be pretty loud, and he's on the internet all the time. But I think you're right. There's a lot of different leaders, and there is a lot of nuance, and not all of the leaders and not all of the members are racist. In fact, I think it's a loud and vocal minority, which gives it a really bad name. I still disagree with a lot of the fundamental precepts of the alt-right, which we will kind of give shape to a little bit later. But I think, yes, the race realists, as they call themselves, there may be some scientific backing. And these are things that we can actually objectively examine with scientific data, with rationality. We don't have to examine it with our feelings. Like you may see from the social justice movement. I think the alt-right actually gives us some meat to actually fight science with science.
Well, yeah. So to be clear, there are definitely some collectivists who are very closely, if not right in the middle of this alt-right movement. Again, not.
I actually think that a lot of them. I think most of them are actually collectivists. But I'll see what you think about this. So.
Well, I don't know. Like, as we're trying to define this, it's hard because there are fuzzy boundaries and there are intersecting movements who have a lot of overlap. There's definitely the connection to the Stormfront, neo-Nazi, racial supremacy, etc. So I don't know where to draw the line, but I can say that I've definitely seen a lot of generalizations and obsession with cultural heritage, which is always hilarious when people, all you hear about is European heritage. It's like, that's great, but what have you done in your life? You're just a fat loser, and you want to claim to have power over other people who, many of them being brilliant individuals. These immigrants, these multiracial immigrants, have a lot more to speak of and have accomplished a lot more than you. So, that's why I think you and I are staunch individualists, but I have seen a lot of obsession with race and heritage and culture, which to me is, it's one thing to recognize trends. It's another to have that be your central theme.
Well, that's that whole reductionist idea that race is culture, and the two are compressed against one another. And So let's examine this fallacy that I'm referring to, and I think you're referring to as well. This is that the Western society is the best society. That's the first assumption. The best society should be preserved, and therefore Western society should be preserved. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. That's one of the observations there. And then they go on to say Western society is comprised of Europeans and their descendants, therefore Europeans must be preserved. So they make that same error. They compress race and culture. Now, here are, I think, some of the big observations out in the world that most of the alt-right movement tends to agree with. And then I'll talk to you about what I've observed when watching some of the videos and reading some of the content, some patterns of and features of the alt-right, and also some things that are not necessary components, but I've also observed. And I want you to be thinking, Danny, and also the rest of the listeners, if they aren't collectivists, where do we draw the line? Do we draw the line at the ideology, or do we draw the line at those ones that are interested in actual policy? How do we delineate this into a more tangible, more understandable movement? And it might be challenging. We may not get it on this conversation, but I hope to elucidate some of you and myself in some of this. And Danny, let me know where I'm going wrong here. One of the big things is that there is objective truth, that ideas and societies can be proven better or worse for society. So that's something that both you and I can agree with. There are truths in the world, and there are things that are good, and they can be actually proven to be so.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Right. So this is a departure from cultural Marxism, and that's where you can see that this is a reaction to it, but also it's an old, idea of going back to objective truth, the Kantian objective truth, or the idea of, the true nature of the thing, the Platonic truth. So whites have higher IQs than minority groups. Now, we were talking about...
Hold on, are you saying that as a fact, or
no?
I'm saying it.
I am examining that as a basic assumption that the alt-right movement tends to make. So they will look at these race and IQ tests. They will examine that whites have higher IQs than some other minority groups. Though, of course, there are some that are willing to admit the superior tested intellect of the East Asians and the Jews, which is humorous because there is a cut of this group that is deeply anti-Semitic, but they recognize that they are highly intelligent, and therefore you have these conspiratorialists that say that the Jews are trying to run everything. The Zionist movement that has infiltrated the neocons, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's. I know I don't want to dwell on that, but just while we're on the topic, I have never understood the anti-Jewish movement, but that's one thing. While we're talking about the alt-right, that I continually see is the caricature of the Jewish guy with the big nose and he's rubbing his hands. Yeah. That pisses me off so much. It's like, if you're going to make these hyperbolic racial stereotypical claims, you really need to back that up. That's an extraordinary claim and requires extraordinary evidence. And I have not seen any of it. All I hear is all this conspiratorial chatter. Like I have lurked the internet for a very long time, and some of the more unsavory places, and I've never found concrete evidence. It's always just the Jews this, the Jews that. And that's one thing that really irritates and also worries me.
Yes, that is a troubling bit too. And this is where they try to use science in order to inform their opinion, but this is where it falls short. And I'll explain to you where some of these things lie. But yeah, the idea of Jared Taylor, the white nationalist, and he calls himself a race realist, and he will stop short of saying that there is a superiority of whites. But his cronies are downright racist, and they will openly denounce Jews as conspiratorial, sort of like those backroom dealing movers and shakers that will end up owning the world. The people that the people that go to these Bilderberg meetings and stuff like that. I mean, you'll constantly hear the Jewish overlord, or the Jewish banks and the Jewish anything that has to do with globalism. The Jews are behind it to some degree, because they are the highest, they're the highest IQ. But of course, their own test falls short when they talk about East Asians, and the whole theory, and this is another observation, is that because of their higher intellect, whites, they were able to build better societies. Of course, if it was simply IQ that made this possible, and they depend so heavily on these IQ tests, they do. Asians have high IQs, higher than whites, on these standardized IQ tests, and they don't seem to want to model society after them. I heard a couple of videos. I believe it was the reason why that's the case is because Asians lack creativity. So that is why they don't emulate some of the Asian societies. But
it's funny you mentioned that. I actually have all kinds of. I'm married to an Asian. I probably shouldn't start revealing personal details, so I'll end up in a FEMA camp. Yep. But I know I've spoken with all sorts of, as you can imagine, Asian folks, and I'm friends with a great many of them. And that is actually something that they openly admit, is that, I don't think anybody is ascribing it to an innate characteristic, but the educational culture or methods in those countries does not produce the most creative people. So that is actually a trend which is not controversial in those countries for the most part. Again,
that's interesting.
Not saying that that's an innate characteristic, but
yeah, it may be a cultural thing that individualism isn't very high in a lot of these. So.
I think you're right.
In a lot of these countries, and art doesn't tend to be promoted. I mean, particularly in the 20th century, you have a terrible history of communism in many of these Asian countries. So the individual was quelched beyond repair in that century. So maybe we'll see some sort of change in that regard. But there might be cultural aspects. There might be innate aspects. I don't know, and I'm not making those sorts of claims, but I'm saying that is a claim of this particular gentleman here.
Right.
These are some of the things that you're familiar with too, Danny.
Yeah. So keep going and
These better societies, what do they consist of? They consist of, to an extent, liberty, although that is subjugated to national identity. Free speech. Free speech is incredibly important, and we'll have to discuss that and how they defend it and why they defend it. But free speech, for free speech's sake, tends to be, one of their highest values, at least, the value of the internet troll, the value of people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who will verbally assault people and will make fun of people just simply because he can, and he'll say as much. Another thing is family cohesiveness. Religion is also part of this better society, particularly Christianity. Individualism is important, but again, subjugated to national identity, and also to a lesser extent, scientific progress.
Okay, so overall, some at face value, very non-controversial, like family cohesiveness, science, free speech. Those are all great things for the most part, in my opinion.
Right. Now, how do they practice this? Oh, and one more thing. I think that there is an observation. We kind of touched upon this. There's an actual planned or concerted effort to actually destroy, to wipe out the white or European culture by other races to create some type of one world. Or the natural effects of globalism and immigration is leading to that same effect.
You're saying that's one of their beliefs.
That is one of their beliefs, that there is an actual apocalyptic, or maybe I could call it a genocide.
I have heard that for sure from some people. Now, how credible that threat is, or these just a few kooks on the left, but I have heard
No. This is not just, I would say, 2/3 to 3/4 of the content that I've consumed, and I'll put a lot of this stuff on the show notes so you guys can watch it yourself. Mention the danger of white culture because of minority groups. Now, some of them prescribe that to be an actual concerted effort, an actual planned attempt to destroy it, and others think that this is the effects of globalism and immigration, that they're losing their identity,
just de facto as a nature of being diluted racially.
Yes, exactly. But here are some of the features that I list, and we'll go through each of them. And Danny, let me know what you think. Nationalism and patriotism in racial identity. This is one of their biggest and probably most manifest, conspicuous feature. It's the what about us idea. You guys get to have your identity, blacks, Latinos, Asians, but what about us? So they believe the right to exist is incredibly important, probably one of the two greatest statements that you could make in the alt-right movement. They have the right to exist and also the right to self-determination, that a peoples have the right to self-determinate. And notice it's not a person, it's a people. That is one of the first clues as to why I think this is a collectivist movement, because they always talk about themselves as the whites, as white people, not as individuals.
Right.
The next thing is whiteness, white interest, and tribalism. I think this mirrors the tribalism found in minority groups. The idea that blacks should stick together, that Hispanics should stick together, and they should have their own culture. And you've got black studies at universities, and I haven't seen a whole lot of Latino studies at universities, but I'm sure that there are some programs out there. But these are bastions of liberal thought, progressive thought. And the alt-right finds these to be fine if you want to do that, but what about us? Mm-hmm. And so you've got that idea of white victimhood, the genocide, the dismantling of the white culture. Minority cultures are quote-unquote tainting the success of Western culture. And they actually believe the apocalyptic prediction that they have, whether it's a concerted effort or not. They believe that they're going to be bred out vis-a-vis Germany. Germany, what's happening in Germany is that their population is not having kids compared to many of the immigrants, many of whom are coming from the Middle East. The Middle Eastern refugees and the immigrants are outbreeding them something like, it's like 2 or 3 to 1. Look here in Germany, what's happening here, or, Italy is not really getting that sort of same immigration problem, but they are having that same old and aging culture, and they're not replenishing their population. So they see that as an issue that will end up hurting white and whiteness and white culture.
Okay, so here's my summation of what I'm sort of hearing so far. And correct me if I'm wrong, for sure.
Yeah.
But the way I see it, in generally speaking, the alt-right, they make the same mistake that a lot of movements make. They, like you say, they are sort of reductionist in the sense that a lot of good things were associated with Western culture, and then, of course, they reduce that down to whiteness. And so when they're concerned about being outbred, my initial thought is, well, who really cares about race? You could have been born black, you could have been born anything. It doesn't matter. But they are, it's a, I don't want to say disguise, but it's a secondary or intermediate step to preserve the things that are connected to their race. That is their culture, their the heritage. But particularly, what's important, you and I both know, is the good ideas that came with the culture, such as, even if you believe in government, is the idea of limited government, liberty, individualism, basically all those precious gems they don't want to lose. And they believe that being outbred racially and having a huge influx of immigrants is going to spell the end of their culture and their race, etc. So the way I see it is there are legitimate grievances, but they fail to address the prime, basically the core, the root of the issue, which is their liberty. But they're trying to achieve it through these various secondary or indirect means, things that are connected but not at the root, but more so through the branches.
Not just indirect or secondary, but some of them, you'll start to understand why I think this is more dangerous than not, or that we should at least be careful of this movement, is because of their prescriptions to these problems. They all lead to the state and collectivism. And I'll mention this shortly, but these are some of the things that you're going to start to see some red flags, Danny. One other thing that I noticed, and I think I mentioned this in our discussion with Jeffrey Tucker, some of the alt-right was heading towards Ron Paul because they liked some of his isolationism. But now you see that in Trump, right? And they latched onto him, that he's interested in keeping America as a nation. To them, that reads, keep America white. Okay, so there's an anti-authoritarianism or establishmentarianism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Okay, they don't really have a whole lot of principle. These people, they just are the kinds of people that like to yell and scream at whatever is currently in power, and that's not really much of a principle at all. It's just simply, you look to the top and you scream down with the authority.
Well, I don't think they are going to be complaining too much to their God Emperor Trump right now. I mean, I think they are actually happy to see their political enemies totally crushed. That's one of my huge problems with the political right, so to speak, is that it's just another flavor of authoritarianism.
I think that there is a strain of this anti-authoritarianism. This anti-authoritarianism was directed at the powers that were, sort of the progressive powers, the Obama administration, the progressives, the social justice warriors, academia, the media, Hollywood, all of these things. And they reject those current powers for future powers, namely their own. And what we will see is that they're no less statist or collectivist than their opponents. They are anti-globalists. They think that there is a globalist scheme, and they want to that wants to subdue or destroy the white culture. We already mentioned that. And principally, this is like a George Soros, or this is a Zionist schemes, and progressives and SJWs are their pawns.
So can I, really quick, to define globalism, because I've heard this a million times, my understanding is that it is an effort to globalize the world under the banner of a one world government. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, that it's difficult and important to parse out the difference between that and the support of a free and open world. Like you and I are both for zero borders because we're against the state, and that would necessarily imply the free immigration of people everywhere. But that would not be considered globalism under their definition, right? What is globalism?
Yeah, well, I think your first part is right. I think that's what they fear. They fear that sort of one world government, radical egalitarianism, where there is no national identity. They fear no borders. They think that tainting of races and culture comes from taking oil and water and mixing them together, or trying to. Two different cultures. They strongly believe that two cultures don't work together, and that because of the fact that they don't work together, because they also have inherent or innate differences like IQ, from which culture is derived, they believe there's not much they can do in the short run or in the long run just give them their own thing, give us our thing. So they resist the idea that we should have a one world, John Lennon-esque utopia. That's
and there is certainly some truth to the idea or the apprehension that, you don't want a huge flood of people who have zero idea of the virtues of liberty and the importance, who are going to come in and completely upend your state and use it against you. Now, of course, there's a difference between that and not wanting to cut off the flow of immigrants. So,
you're right. I want to be specific here, because you did mention that we aren't for borders. I think the importance of embordering and delineating territory that is privately owned, and that one could actually, in fact, trespass on private property.
Absolutely.
Now, I wanted to make that very clear. And I think that these are some issues that I would like to address: immigration and borders and stuff like that. We actually plan to have a guest on in the near future to talk about that sort of thing. So so stay tuned for that. But I just want to make that clear. So this is where the statism comes in. So they're anti-globalists, and how do you preserve the culture? You prescribe a strong state that has strong borders and can defend it, and it is a centralized authority that can prevent immigration, can deport people. They're constantly concerned with immigration law. You always hear them talking about that. They're very protectionist in their trade. They believe that some free trade is good, but not all free trade is good. Getting Japanese cars imported over here hurts U.S. automakers, and so therefore they are interested in putting tariffs. They believe that that's better in protecting our domestic trade, and that international trade in the long run is not all that great. And they're also traditionalist, and I think that there's a certain amount of anti-enlightenmentalism in them. Christianity is not everybody in the alt-right is not Christian. There is a strong Christian strain, like that, those sort of paleo-conservatives. But for, I think, many, Christianity is viewed as a link to the past. It's a cultural mechanism for which they are able to deliver successful tradition through. And it's also a fundamental truth for other people. So it's not necessary, but Christianity in general tends to be, you tend to see it more often than not. And they hate egalitarianism. That's that sort of Enlightenment idea that all people are equal under the law, but the radical egalitarianism is even more of those people that believe that all people are equal.
Yeah, because I respect Milo Yiannopoulos for the most part, and he, I think, describes himself as an egalitarian, but of rights, not of outcome. He believes everybody should be treated as an individual. Now, of course, he goes awry when it comes to the hardcore statism and build the wall and all that nonsense. But, their egalitarianism of rights, that all humans are created equal or exist equally, in the description of their rights, I think is a perfectly valid idea. And I don't...
Well, it may be for some, but people like Jared Taylor, who Milo Yiannopoulos considered one of the leaders of the movement and is also considered a race realist, he completely rejects egalitarianism. He believes that there are differences in races that make them better or worse for certain things.
But
he doesn't go on to say that superior, but he does say that there are differences innate to people.
But is he advocating that they be treated differently in terms of, like, you as a human do not have the right to steal from other people, the rights to life, liberty, and property? Is he saying that we should treat them differently under, quote, the law?
Well, he's interested in getting rid of those who are different.
So yeah.
So they wouldn't exist in the state.
Okay, so therefore, no, he is not for egalitarianism of rights. Yeah, by nature of the fact that he wants to violate other people's rights. I suppose that answered my own question.
Important difference to note between communism and fascism is that idea of the purity and nationalism of the race, and that you see a lot in fascism and you don't see so much in communism. The Russians are proud people. They definitely, and they killed many, many, many people, but they killed a lot of their own people. The Germans were killing a lot of others. So they're interested in purity by excluding. The communists wanted to include everyone, include at the point of a gun. Okay, that's a very important observation that I think needs to be made in differentiation between the two. But they're both status, and they both, from the outside, they can look very similar. Here's some non-essential components that I ended up seeing from some videos and not others. This one, Danny, I'm interested in hearing your take. There is a certain mean-spiritedness from a lot of alt-righters because their home is online, and this is very often where you will see them most at home because they enjoy the anonymity. Now, that doesn't make their vote any less or more powerful, as you can see with a lot of them coming out to vote for Donald Trump. But there is, not necessarily, but noticeably, a mean-spiritedness in the defense of things like freedom of speech. Which for you and I, it's not a right, it's a natural outgrowth of self-ownership. You can do whatever you want with your body. So there's not a right to free speech, there is a right to self-ownership, and you can say whatever you want. That's where we derive that particular viewpoint. It's not like a separate right in and of itself.
Yeah, and that's a very, very good observation. You don't have the right to go on someone else's property and spout, Nazism or whatever the hell you want. Free speech in a free society is a resultant, not an end into itself. But of course, I do believe it would exist. But to your point,
yes, it would.
I've noticed a huge troll element, and that's where this frog, they call it Pepe, their meme, is
Pepe
like
the frog,
ubiquitous. Yeah. And it's one thing to have this backlash against the leftists and make fun of them, and to watch on as they melt down in the election of Trump and sort of enjoy that spectacle. But you're right, there is actually a bullying element, and I don't like to use the word bullying trivially because a lot of people do, but I'll give you an example. Actually, recently in a local school not too far from where I'm at, there were a bunch of kids, like the day after Trump got elected, who were shouting "Build the Wall" at a bunch of Latino students in their lunchroom at some high school, I think.
That was somewhere in our state. I know the city. I just read the article earlier today and yesterday, and I actually know one of the parents of one of the children that bore witness to that. And apparently it was quite overblown, that it was a small group of kids that thought that by building the wall, they were keeping drugs out. This is what was mentioned in a long Facebook post. This young mom was very worried about the school in question being revealed in the paper, because actually the school was getting threats from people against these poor kids that were saying build the wall.
Well, in any case, to target a group of students based on their race and then to shout them down like that, however, I wasn't there, I didn't witness it, but that is, not a nice thing to do. I can't imagine myself doing that. It's one thing to support this retarded wall, but it's another to chant it to a group of kids based on where they came from. And those kids really don't care about politics, I'm sure, and have nothing to do with drugs or illegal immigration. Anyways, I totally agree. Yeah. There's a huge trolling element, and unfortunately they've taken it too far to the point where they're complete a-holes on the internet. And whatever. I'm not going to sit here and try to discredit their ideas because they're mean, but it's not great. Why? Why do you have to do that?
Well, I think it's the reason why they do that is because they believe that freedom of speech should be defended at all costs, and freedom of speech is important. But as we said, it's a natural outgrowth of self-ownership. Here in America, it's a separate right, and there's many reasons as to why to defend liberty in general. And that liberty, while it should be defended, it's fantastic for what we're doing right here, right now. I think that these people on the alt-right take it to an extreme because their sole intent is to offend.
Right. They want to see how far they can take it. Right.
And their aggression is directed at SJWs, progressives, the left, and even much of the right, which they use the word conservative.
Oh, God.
Yes.
The word cuck. If there's one way you could describe the alt-right, it's that word. That's one thing. Actually, Mike, I'm so glad you brought that up. It's been super illuminating as to how much a lot of these people are simply followers. I've really almost never heard the word cuck in my life before this movement. And now it's ubiquitous in every conversation with one of these people. If you disagree with me, if you have any compassion or empathy, you are a cuck, which means you want someone else to sleep with your wife. It's like, okay, there is a middle ground. You don't have to be a total man's man or an utter wimp who wants to lay down and give up your rights.
Right. Yeah. I think the cuck it's somebody that either wittingly or not is too little of a man to be able to defend their wife against the onslaught of people that are interested in sleeping with them. And it's a very old word, cuckold, cuck. I mean, it's very strange that they came up with this, and I think it's gotten to the point where it's just what might have been like cute is now just incredibly pernicious.
It just goes to show how much of them are not free thinkers. They're just followers. When you start parroting the actual word, the insult, it just goes to show how easily these people can be manipulated and swept into a movement and are really in it for the fanfare and the the spectacle of build the wall and God Lord Trump and Pepe the meme. It's just become a stupid fad at this point for a lot of them.
Right. So to sum up this piece right here, there's definitely a non-essential component of Nazism and anti-Semitism. It's not, Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't think is an anti-Semite, for instance. I think that there are others like Fox Day, the sci-fi writer. I don't think he is an anti-Semite either. But there is a strain that Stormfront crowd, the white supremacist, to a lesser extent the race realist, who may not say it outright, but there is an idea of superiority and an inferiority implied within their views. As I said, religiosity may or may not be present. And then also there's selective scientific acceptance, like race and IQ. Like this is our thing, and this is why we believe this way. And blacks are inferior because they have an IQ level less than whites. So therefore, every single one of the blacks that I see is of lesser IQ. This is sort of this might be an egregious hyperbole here, but I'm giving you the logical extension of some of the stuff that they're talking about. The last thing before we actually conclude our podcast is briefly going over this. This actually might necessitate another episode. We see this often. This might necessitate another episode. There's so much to talk about. You guys know as listeners, but there's a lot of libertarians that find this movement appealing. Danny, we talked a little bit about this with Jeffrey Tucker, but the alt-right has found its home in a lot of the hearts and minds of some libertarians. And I think that these are some of those individuals that may not have either had a very strong foundation and understanding of why libertarianism is what it is and the philosophies behind it. As you said earlier, some of these things do not seem like they would be all that bad. And in fact, some of them are innocuous or possibly even good, and really just preferential things that one free society could perform rather than the other, preserving a particular culture, being multiculturalist and all that sort of stuff. Some have accepted the understanding that there is an imminent danger to the white race, and they are willing to take the medicine of the state in order to solve the white issue.
Yeah, that unfortunately, this is the short-term. Well, everybody wants to take the quick fix, and that's pretty disappointing to watch. As you said, the libertarian movement, and it seems like half of them have left for the boat of the state, and they, of course, don't realize they are further entrenching us in those ideas, but those are the weak-minded ones. I don't really want them back. The likes of Stefan Molyneux, etc. I don't want to call him weak-minded, but they really go astray, and they don't realize the damage they're doing in this quick fix. Everybody thinks, you got me on a rant here, Mike. Everybody thinks it's the end of the world. We're always on the precipice of doom. And wouldn't you know it, the world goes on, and if you continually advocate for close the borders right now. We're going to seal us off, stop free trade, stop everything, encapsulate us in time. Right now, this is perfect. It doesn't get any better. That is a recipe for disaster. And I don't know. I advocate for the long-term solution. And that's where these guys go astray, is they want to freeze us in time and codify the state. And they don't realize they're cheering on the power that's going to stomp on their neck down the road. You mentioned Steph Molyneux. I think it would be lovely to address the failings of a man that we held at one point so near and dear. For now, I'll simply say that the man has disappointed me immensely with his embracing of some of the less savory aspects of the alt-right. And for somebody who was at one point so principled that he recommended to others abandoning loved ones if they did not agree with your principles, now is a staunch Trump supporter. You may look up his videos and see for yourself. I want to know what you think of all of this now that we've talked a little bit more about it. And well, my evaluation overall is that there's a lot of good stuff if you dig down kernels of truth here and there, but like you aptly pointed out, they confuse and conflate and reduce a lot of concepts and groups and institutions, and they really muddy the waters and fail to prescribe first they fail to diagnose the problem precisely. They have a foggy general idea, and what's worse is that their prescription is flawed as a necessary result. So all of the grievances and problems and legitimate issues that the alt-right has with the rest of the world and leftism and globalism, those can all be traced back and parsed out as a departure from liberty. I don't want to make it sound like a panacea, but really that's what all the problems boil down to. And the degree to which you depart from liberty in your solutions, you're simply going to whack-a-mole one and come up with another. That's my personal, I realize I'm being really vague here, but their desire to close off borders and enact protectionist policies, and their failure to parse out the ills of multiculturalism, they take it too far. They go to collectivism as opposed to individualism, which is the cure to all of these problems, and private property as opposed to nationalism in the state. So you do recognize? Do you think
after I've talked about this that they are more collectivist than not? Are you buying into that a little bit more now, or are you still skeptical?
Yeah. No, I agree. They are collectivists of another flavor. And that's my biggest problem with the people. Nationalism is trashionalism, in my opinion, and so is patriotism. And I realize the state right now is their Mac Daddy, their mafia extorter, who's their unsavory overlord, but they're embracing it instead of rejecting it, and that's where they go wrong.
I think that's right. In fact, right when I'll have to develop this idea a little bit further, but I think that there are stark comparisons between the 20th century conflict between fascism and communism. As I alluded to earlier, though fascism was born and fostered and ended up allied to communism before the distinction, Nazism and Hitler made from Stalinism. This is something that the left would like to deny, that communism and socialism and Nazism do not have incredible similarities. Many economists, historians have pointed this out only on the basis that the left finds their arch nemesis, the Nazis, on the far right. And they like to point on the other side and say that's the case. No, it's all statism. It's just one's a little left-leaning. And I think, like I said, one's inclusive and one is exclusive. I think the differentiating piece was compassion. That was the element, that the idea of the nurturing mother, the mother to the child, was what one sociologist and psychologist, he's from Canada, I'll have to list him in the show notes, he's done a study on it, and he's been attacked quite a bit for actually attacking safe spaces in Toronto, but he's talking about why fascism and why communism, what the differences are. They're both collectivists, but the difference is the exclusive and the inclusive, and communism tends to be that more motherly, nurturing, everyone should be included, and fascism doesn't really have that nearly as much. I see that a lot in the SJW, the social justice movement, and the alt-right.
Well, to any alt-righters who actually made it this far and who are willing to critically examine their ideas, I give everybody credit for, the difficult thinkers. There are honest and, well-intentioned people on the left and on the right. And for whatever reason, they've ended up where they are. But if you would consider the alternative, join us as we propose a superior solution, not a be-all, end-all, but something that we believe is the antidote to statism on both sides. And we, I'm sure, can offer you solutions to all of your grievances, permanent solutions, through the use of liberty. If we are principled and take your principles all the way to the very end and maintain logical consistency, you'd be surprised with what you can come up with. Sorry for the shameless plug, but wanted to extend the hand of rational and logical problem solving, and we can come to some
what a
common
good salesman you are. On your own show even. That's so shameless. Yes. And of course, if you are an member of the alt-right, you consider yourself that, and you want to come on the show, write to us, flagshipfreedompodcast@gmail.com. flagshipfreedompodcast@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook page. You can find us, facebook.com/flagshipfreedom. Look us up and get a hold of us. If you want to come on the show and talk about your ideas, we are free to have you. And that goes for everyone, of course, that is listening to the show. We would love to have you on. So that is about all. Danny, anything else? I mean, you close with a delicious speech. I can't do much better.
I'm all set. Thank you, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening to Flagship Freedom. We are the podcast that places in the front line of the war of ideas. Until the next battle, bye-bye.
And that one desire is you. And I know nobody else ain't gonna do.